Is there a rivalry brewing between Angel Reese and Kiki Iriafen? Every time these two ladies face off, there seems to be some bad blood in the air. There seems to be some tension between the two. Those two faced off in USA camp, Kiki Iriafen taking it right to Angel Reese's chest, knocking her over. Yesterday, they went head-to-head in the preseason. Kiki Iriafen saying, "Get that weak stuff out of here."
There's a moment in sports when the crowd stops cheering and starts reacting. Not to a play, not to a score, but to a person. That shift from celebration to something sharper, something more directed, is one of the rarest and most revealing things you can witness inside an arena. And recently, that's exactly what happened when Angel Reese stepped onto the floor. The name that once drew roars of excitement suddenly became something else entirely. Something heavier. Something that carried weight beyond the game itself. What caused that swing? What turned an ordinary preseason matchup into a cultural flashpoint? And what does any of this have to do with a quietly emerging big named Kiki Iriafen? Because if you've been paying attention, these two have been building towards something every single time they share the same court. And it's starting to feel less like a basketball matchup and more like a full-blown rivalry that's beginning to reshape the entire conversation around women's basketball. This is the story of two players, two styles, and one narrative that's growing louder by the day. Before we even get to the game itself, we need to understand the environment Angel Reese walked into. Because by this point, she doesn't just enter arenas. She enters storylines. The moment her name appears on a roster, the conversation starts. And lately, that conversation has been moving in a direction that's a lot less comfortable for her than it used to be. Questions had already started circulating around her role, her consistency, and her place within lineup decisions. Those aren't small things. When a player carries that kind of narrative into a game, the stakes feel different before tip-off. Every mistake gets magnified. Every positive moment gets picked apart. Nothing is allowed to exist in a vacuum because the audience has already formed a lens through which they're watching. That's not unique to Angel Reese. Every high-profile player deals with some version of it. But what makes her situation particularly intense is the volume of it. The spotlight that follows her doesn't dim between games. It stays on and it invites reaction constantly. Social media, sports commentary, fan culture, it all feeds into the atmosphere around her in a way that can shift the energy of an actual building without a single play being made. And that's exactly what started happening. The arena wasn't just responding to what was on the court, it was responding to the story it had already built in its head. And right in the middle of that story, Kiki Iriafen showed up and made herself impossible to ignore. If Angel Reese is the player who commands attention through personality, presence, and emotional intensity, then Kiki Iriafen is building her reputation through something quieter but equally powerful. She lets her game do the announcing. And increasingly that game is announcing itself very loudly, especially in moments when it matters most. Their first notable collision didn't happen in a regular season game. It happened at USA camp, where the competition is supposed to be clean and professional and controlled. But the moment Iriafen stepped into the paint and took it directly at Reese, knocking her back with a confident physical move, something cracked open. The moment had an edge to it that went beyond normal scrimmage intensity. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. Iriafen made contact, stood her ground, and sent a clear message without saying a single word. That's a language players understand immediately. And Reese, who has never been someone to back down from physicality, understood it perfectly. The tension was real from that point forward. Then came the preseason matchup, and everything that had been simmering below the surface came boiling up again. Iriafen went straight to the paint, attacked with confidence, and at one point delivered a stop on Reese with the kind of decisive, physical defense that shifts momentum in an instant. Her response afterward, the verbal punctuation of "get that weak stuff out of here," wasn't just trash talk. It was a declaration. It said something very specific about how she sees this matchup and about how seriously she takes Reese as a competitive challenge. Because here's the thing, you don't talk to someone that way unless you respect them as competition. You don't put that kind of energy into a matchup unless you know the stakes of it. Iriafen wasn't dismissing Reese. She was competing against her at the highest emotional register, which actually says more about how significant the rivalry is becoming than any highlight play could. What was supposed to be a low-stakes, routine preseason night slowly transformed into something far more intense and revealing. The expected rhythms of a warm-up game never really materialized. Instead, every possession felt heavier than it should have. Every foul felt more charged, and every reaction from the crowd felt amplified in a way that had nothing to do with what the scoreboard was showing. Iriafen came out aggressive from the opening sequence. She was attacking the paint on offense, active on defense, and making it clear that she wasn't going to ease into the evening and let things develop slowly. She set a pace, and the question became whether Reese could match it or whether she'd find herself reacting to it instead of dictating her own terms. Early on, there were flashes of the competitive fire that Reese always brings. She was physical, engaged, and trying to impose herself the way she always does. But something felt slightly off. Instead of controlling the tempo, she seemed to be chasing it. And in basketball, there's a world of difference between setting the pace and spending the whole night trying to catch up to someone else's. The key sequence came when Reese drove hard toward the rim, looking to finish through contact the way she has in countless games before. It's a move built on her body, her strength, and her willingness to absorb punishment on the way to the basket. But Iriafen was already there, positioned perfectly, timed cleanly. She didn't just contest the shot. She shut it down completely and sent a message with her body language after the play that left no room for misinterpretation. She knew exactly what she had done. Reese shot back with a stare that carried plenty of heat. That exchange, two players locked in a moment of pure competitive confrontation, became the emotional centerpiece of the night. But what happened next mattered even more than the exchange itself. Because on the following trips down the floor, Reese came back to the rim again. And again, Iriafen was there, timed, ready, positioned. It stopped being a single stop and became a pattern. And patterns are what shape narratives. What made Iriafen's performance particularly impactful wasn't just what she was doing on the defensive end, it was how she was showing up on both sides of the floor. Good defense is valuable. Good defense, paired with offensive versatility, is what separates players who can contain a moment from players who can define one. Iriafen started knocking down shots from the perimeter. She was finishing aggressively inside when she drove. She showed comfort reading the game in real time, adjusting to what the defense gave her and taking what was available rather than forcing outcomes that weren't there. There was a level of poise in her offensive game that felt developed, not like something she was trying out for the first time. When you combine that perimeter shooting with the interior physicality she was already showing defensively, the picture that emerges is of a player who is actively expanding her profile. She's not just a rim protector anymore. She's not just a physical presence in the paint, she's becoming a multi-dimensional threat who reads situations, responds to them, and adds to her game in ways that compound over time. That's the kind of development that tends to generate quiet praise at first, then louder conversation, and eventually becomes part of a defining narrative. And when you stack it against the storyline forming around Reese's consistency at the finishing level, the contrast becomes unavoidable. Not because anyone is manufacturing it, but because basketball rarely lets two things exist side by side without the audience drawing a comparison. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because what happened in that arena went beyond anything happening between the two players on the court. At some point during the evening, the crowd's reaction shifted. The chants and the energy that had been building stopped feeling like general basketball excitement and started feeling like something more specifically directed. Angel Reese's name was being used in a way that felt less like support and more like commentary. The irony of the situation is that it reflected something much bigger about modern sports culture. Players can become part of the atmosphere of a building without even being on the floor in a given moment. The story around them, the social media conversations, the online narratives, all of it travels into real-world spaces and shapes how crowds respond. The chants that rang out during a separate moment involving a player connected to Reese through personal storylines told you everything about how much these off-court narratives had permeated the room. What began as internet conversation had become arena energy. And for Reese, who has always drawn her fuel from the crowd and from the emotion of big moments, this particular kind of energy works very differently than she's used to. Normally, the noise lifts a player. It creates momentum and turns individual plays into collective experiences. But when the noise becomes something more critical, more ironic, or more pointed, it stops being fuel and starts being pressure. And pressure at that volume, in that kind of environment, is one of the hardest things in sports to manage in real time. You could see it registering, not in a way that suggested collapse, because Angel Reese has never been someone who collapses under attention, but in a way that made everything feel slightly louder and heavier than it should have on a routine preseason night. One of those moments where the game and the atmosphere surrounding it pull in completely different directions, and the player caught in the middle has to figure out which one to respond to. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something that doesn't always get addressed in these conversations. The level of scrutiny aimed at Angel Reese is not always proportional to what's actually happening on the court. Her rebounding remains one of the most reliable and productive parts of her game. She continues to compete physically and stays engaged in every possession, win or lose. The effort has never been the question. But here's how these things work in the current media landscape. When a player builds a massive public profile, the expectations that come attached to that profile don't always align with where the player actually is in their development. And when performance and perception don't line up, criticism fills the space between them faster than almost anything else. Meanwhile, players who develop more quietly benefit from lower baseline expectations. When Lauren Betts had a controlled, polished performance in the same environment, it was framed as encouraging progress. When Reese had an uneven night in the same game, it was interpreted as confirmation of concerns that were already circulating. That's not a balanced framework. But it's the one that exists, and it's the one that both players are navigating right now. The comparison between them isn't something either player is creating. It's something the environment is generating around them. And once those comparisons start piling up, they stop being isolated observations and become part of a larger story that takes on its own momentum. What makes this rivalry genuinely compelling beyond the wins and losses is what it represents at a deeper level. These two players embody completely different approaches to the game, and when those approaches collide, the result is more than just a basketball matchup. Kiki Iriafen is building something that communicates through execution. Her game is calculated, reads situations, and lets results carry the message. She doesn't need to be loudest in the room because her performance is doing the talking in a language that doesn't require translation. Angel Reese, on the other hand, has always operated in the visible, emotional, confrontational register. She brings heat into every possession. She reacts, engages, and feeds off the moment in a way that turns individual plays into events. That intensity is a genuine gift when it's channeled correctly. It's the thing that made her magnetic in the first place and brought her the level of attention that very few players at her stage of development ever receive. But when those two styles meet under high-pressure circumstances, the contrast becomes impossible to miss. One reads as controlled, one reads as reactive. And in the current conversation around these two players, that contrast is being interpreted in a very specific way that's shaping how both of them are being evaluated. This is where we arrive at the part of the story that matters most, because none of this is finished. If anything, it feels like a beginning, a setup for something that hasn't fully played out yet. Angel Reese has proven repeatedly that she can handle attention. That's never been in doubt. The question that's emerging now is whether she can redirect it. Whether she can take the noise, the criticism, the crowd energy, all of it, and use it to power something on the floor that changes the conversation entirely. Players who find themselves in these moments usually go one of two ways. Some let the external noise start reshaping how they play. They press harder than they should, force outcomes that aren't available, and end up confirming the concerns rather than quieting them. Others find a way to simplify everything, strip it back to what they do best, and let steady, consistent production shift the narrative over time. The version of Angel Reese that powers through contact, cleans up rebounds in traffic, and brings genuine physicality to every possession is still very much present. What she needs to find is the version that pairs that intensity with execution, finishes that go in, decisions that read the defense rather than challenge it, moments where the effort and the efficiency line up at the same time, which is honestly the most difficult thing in sports to sustain. And as for Kiki Iriafen, she's building something with clear intentionality. She's expanding her offensive toolkit, holding her own defensively in high-stakes matchups, and finding ways to assert herself in moments where it counts. The quiet confidence she carries into these situations is already becoming a defining characteristic, and if that development continues at this rate, the conversation around her is going to get significantly louder. The most honest thing you can say about where Angel Reese and Kiki Iriafen stand right now is this. What we've seen so far is a preview, a first chapter of something that's clearly going to keep building as the season progresses and as these two continue to cross paths on and off the court. The competitive edge between them is undeniable. The crowd knows it, the players know it, everyone watching knows it. And in sports, that kind of tension is actually a gift because it transforms routine matchups into must-watch events and turns individual performances into cultural moments that people remember long after the final buzzer. For Angel Reese, the opportunity is still very much in front of her. The same crowd that used her name as a punchline on a tense preseason night is capable of turning that same name into a rallying cry the moment performances start matching potential. That's how quickly these things can flip, and she knows that better than anyone. For Kiki Iriafen, the stage is getting bigger. Every time she steps into a high-pressure moment and delivers, the conversation around her expands. The challenge for her now is sustaining it, building on it, and proving that what we're seeing isn't a peak, but a foundation. When these two meet again under the same lights with the same stakes and the same crowd watching, everything that's been building will have a moment to breathe. And however that crowd responds in that moment, whether it's cheering, challenging, or something entirely unexpected, it will tell us exactly how far this story has come. Because in sports, the most compelling narratives aren't the ones that end quickly. They're the ones that keep developing, keep surprising, and keep demanding your attention long after you think you've figured them out. This one is just getting started.